I never thought my life would turn out like this. My name is Anna, and this is my story. I was born to farmers, good people who taught me the value of hard work from the time I could walk. Our days started early, before the sun came up, taking care of the animals and crops. Life was simple then. I would go to school, come home, and help out on the farm. Weekends were for spending time with family and catching up on chores. It was all I knew, and I was happy with it. But things changed after I graduated high school. My parents, bless them, wanted more for me than a life on the farm. One evening at dinner, my dad said, "Anna, we've been talking. Your mom and I think you should go to college." And just like that, my world got bigger. I packed my bags and moved to the city, a place so different from what I was used to that it felt like another world. College was an experience. The classes were interesting, but it was the people that really opened my eyes. Students came from all kinds of backgrounds, with dreams and plans I had never imagined. Then I met Scott in my third year. He was charming, confident, and so different from the farm boys back home. Scott seemed to know exactly what he wanted from life. "Life's too short to spend it working all the time," he'd say, lying on the grass outside the library. "We should enjoy it while we're young." I was hooked. He made life seem like an adventure, not just a list of chores. We started dating, and before I knew it, we were talking about getting married. When I told my parents, they were cautious. They wanted to meet Scott and get to know the man who had won my heart. After Scott's first visit to the farm, my dad said, "He seems nice enough, but there's something I can't put my finger on. Just be careful, Anna." I brushed off his concerns. What did my old-fashioned dad know about love? Scott was perfect, and our life was going to be perfect too. My parents, being the kind people they are, paid for our wedding and even bought us an apartment in the city. "We want you to have a good start," my mom said, her eyes misty. "Thanks, Mom and Dad," I said, hugging them tightly. "I promise I'll make you proud." As Scott and I stood at the altar, exchanging vows and rings, I thought my life was all set. I had a husband who I thought loved me, a good job in the city, and a bright future ahead. The first couple of years of our marriage seemed fine to me. Scott and I both worked in the city, and we settled into a routine. But looking back, I can see the signs that things weren't as perfect as I thought. "Do we really have to go to your parents' farm this weekend?" Scott would complain every time I suggested a visit. "It smells like manure, and your dad always wants me to help with something." I'd sigh and try to explain, "They're my family, Scott, and they've done so much for us." He'd grumble, "Fine, but I'm not shoveling any cow poop." I brushed it off, thinking he was just a city boy not used to farm life. I grew up with those smells and chores. But now I wonder if that was a red flag. 3 years into our marriage, I got pregnant. I was over the moon, and my parents were thrilled. "A grandchild," my mom squealed over the phone. "Oh, Anna, we're so happy for you." Scott, on the other hand, wasn't as excited. "A kid already? I guess that's okay." I figured he was just nervous and that he'd warm up to the idea of being a dad. My parents, as always, were incredibly supportive. They bought us a car and even paid for our vacations. I was so grateful, but Scott seemed to take it all for granted. "Of course they're helping us," he'd say. "That's what parents are supposed to do." When our son Peter was born, I fell in love with him instantly. But Scott struggled. He tried, but fatherhood didn't come easily to him. "Can't you keep that kid quiet?" he'd complain when Peter cried at night. "Some of us have to work in the morning." I held back my frustration, telling myself we were both just getting used to being parents. Life went on, and we visited the farm when we could, though Scott became more reluctant with each trip. "Your dad wants me to help fix the tractor again," he'd groan. "I'm not a mechanic." I'd watch my dad and Scott working together, my dad patiently showing him how to fix things while Scott fumbled with the tools, looking annoyed. Then, within a year, both of my parents passed away. I was heartbroken. "They're gone, Scott." I sobbed into his shoulder. "I can't believe they're really gone." He patted my back awkwardly and said, "It'll be okay. At least they left us the farm." His words shocked me. The farm, my family's legacy, and all Scott could think about was what we'd inherited. A few months later, Scott dropped a bombshell. "We should sell the farm," he said one night at dinner. We could buy a big house in the city and live like royalty. I wanted to argue, to fight for my family's legacy, but I was so tired, worn down by grief and the challenges of being a mom. Wasn't I supposed to support my husband's decisions? Okay, I said quietly, if you think it's best. And just like that, with a few signatures on some papers, my family's history was sold to the highest bidder. The money went into our joint account, and Scott was overjoyed. We're set for life, Anna, he said, thrilled. No more working ourselves to the bone. We can do whatever we want now. I nodded and smiled, trying to push down the emptiness I felt inside. This was what Scott wanted, and as his wife, wasn't I supposed to support him? After selling the farm, life changed. The money from the sale gave us some comfort. I'll give Scott that. We didn't have to work as hard anymore. We both cut back to part-time hours, and for a while, it felt like we were living the dream. But as time passed, I started noticing things. Scott, who had never been much of a hard worker, seemed to lose all motivation. He'd quit jobs without a second thought, always with some excuse. That boss was a jerk, he'd say, or they expected too much. I'm not a slave, you know. I tried to reason with him. Scott, we can't live off the farm money forever. We need to think about the future. He'd just wave me off. Relax, Anna. We're set for life. Why work ourselves to death? Meanwhile, our son Peter was growing up quickly. He finished high school, then college, and soon he was working and living on his own. I was so proud of him, but I missed having him around. One day, I was reading the newspaper when a name jumped out at me. It was an article about a successful concrete plant owned by Scott's Uncle John. Scott. I called out, "Did you see this article about your Uncle John?" Scott's face darkened. "I don't want to hear about that old tyrant," he snapped. I knew the story, at least Scott's version of it. His parents had died when he was young, leaving him in the care of his uncle. Scott always said John had been controlling, trying to force him into the family business. He never listened to what I wanted, Scott had told me years ago. It was always about what he thought was best, so I left and started my own life. Looking at Scott now, lounging in his robe at 1 p.m, I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the story. Maybe it's time to make peace, I suggested gently. It's been years, Scott. People change. Scott's reaction was instant and explosive. Make peace with that control freak? No way. Drop it, Anna. I let it go, but the whole thing left me feeling uneasy. There was so much anger, so much resentment in Scott's words. It made me wonder what else he was holding on to, what other parts of himself he was keeping hidden. One quiet Friday afternoon, I overheard Scott on the phone. His voice was short and cold. "I'm not interested in his life, and it doesn't concern me," he said sharply before hanging up. My curiosity got the better of me. "Who was that, honey?" I asked. Scott's face showed no emotion. "Hospital. My uncle's sick. If he dies, maybe I'll finally get something out of him." I was shocked. "Scott, that's a horrible thing to say." "He raised you?" "Yeah, and he made my life hell," Scott snapped. "I'm not going to see him. End of story." He picked up the remote and settled back into his chair. Something broke inside me. This wasn't the man I had married. This wasn't the person I thought I knew. Without saying a word to Scott, I went to the bedroom and called Peter. "Hey, sweetie," I said when he answered. "How would you feel about meeting your great uncles?" Peter was surprised but agreed quickly. An hour later, we walked into the hospital, my heart racing. The ICU was filled with the sound of beeping machines and soft voices. There, in a bed surrounded by monitors, was Scott's Uncle John. He looked small and weak, nothing like the controlling man Scott had described. When we introduced ourselves, his eyes filled with tears. "Anna, Peter," he said, his voice soft but warm. "I've wanted to meet you for so long." For the next hour, John told us his side of the story. He explained how he had taken Scott in after his parents died and raised him like his own. "I loved that boy," John said, his voice breaking. "I wanted him to have everything, carry on the family business, have a good life. But Scott had other ideas." John went on to explain that Scott didn't want the responsibility. He said he didn't want to work hard like I did, staying up at night worrying about the business. As John spoke, I felt a sinking feeling. His words painted a picture I knew all too well. Scott demanded I sell the business, John said, shaking his head. He wanted me to give him a monthly allowance, an apartment, a car. He said I owed him a carefree life. I glanced at Peter, and I could see the same shock on his face. I told him that's not how life works, John continued. I begged him to stay and learn the business, but he just got angry. He said he'd find a rich wife and never have to work again. I sat in Uncle John's hospital room, and memories from the past 12 years flooded my mind. It was like I was finally seeing the truth. Scott had never kept a job for long. He always worked part-time, called in sick, and took lots of days off. I had always thought it was because he was stressed or just a free spirit, but now I understood. He would always say, "Life is for fun, Anna. Why work so hard?" A sick feeling hit me as I realized that Scott didn't marry me for love. He married me for my family's money, for the easy life he thought I could give him. I was just a way for him to get what he wanted, the rich wife he had promised his uncle he'd find. Tears filled my eyes as the truth sank in. Our life, our marriage, our family, it had all been built on a lie. Uncle John's weak voice pulled me from my thoughts. "I'm so sorry," he said. "I wanted to leave something for you and Peter, but I can't." "It's okay," I said, squeezing his hand. "We don't need anything." "I had plans," John continued, sounding upset. "A new project. It would have changed everything, but I ran out of time." Suddenly, John's face twisted in pain, and the machines around him started beeping urgently. A nurse rushed in. "You need to leave," she said. A few days later, the call came. Uncle John had passed away. When I told Scott, his reaction made my blood run cold. "Finally," he exclaimed, grinning. "Took the old bastard long enough." I stared at him, horrified. "Scott, he was your uncle. He raised you." Scott waved me off. Yeah, so when's the funeral? Do I need to go?" In the end, Scott didn't attend the funeral. Peter and I arranged it ourselves. It was a small, dignified service that I hoped would have made Uncle John proud. While I was mourning a man I had barely known, my husband was at home celebrating, calculating his new wealth. I overheard him on the phone when I got home, saying, "The factory's got to be worth at least 30 million. Can you believe it? I'm rich." I watched Scott strut around the house, bragging about his inheritance, and felt nothing but disgust. This wasn't the man I thought I'd married. He was a stranger in my husband's skin. Then things got even worse. One evening, Scott looked at me with cold eyes and said, "You know, Anna, you're getting kind of old for me. I think it's time for an upgrade." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Excuse me?" I asked. He shrugged, not even trying to look guilty. "You heard me. I'm rich now. I can do better." Over the next few weeks, Scott's behavior spiraled out of control. He stayed out late, coming home in the early morning, reeking of alcohol and perfume. More than once, I was left feeling like I had lost everything. I noticed lipstick stains on Scott's collar, and every time I confronted him, he'd brush me off. "Mind your own business," he'd say. "You should be grateful I come home at all." One night, as I lay awake, listening to him stumble in at 4 a.m., I realized something had to change. I couldn't keep living like this. I deserved better, but more importantly, I needed to know the truth about Scott, about the inheritance, and about the life I thought we had built together. One morning, after another night of Scott coming home at dawn, I'd had enough. "Where were you?" I demanded, my voice shaking with anger and hurt. Scott rubbed his bloodshot eyes and narrowed them at me. "None of your damn business, Anna. You should be grateful I even come back at all." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Grateful? Is that what you think our marriage is?" He ignored my question, his eyes calculating. "How much is left from your parents' inheritance? We must have some savings, right?" The sudden change of topic caught me off guard. "What?" "Scott, we've spent it all. The accounts are empty." His face twisted with disgust. "Empty? You've got to be kidding me." He paced the room, muttering to himself, then turned to me, his eyes cold. "Well, I guess that's it then. I'm done here. Done with you." Before I could respond, the front door opened and Peter walked in, his eyes widening as he saw the tension in the room. Scott's demeanor shifted instantly. He forced a smile and walked over to our son. "Peter, my boy, just the person I wanted to see. I need you to sign something for me." Scott pulled a document from his pocket and handed it to Peter. "It's just a formality. You're giving up any claim to Uncle John's estate. Since there's no will, it all comes to me anyway." Peter looked confused, glancing at me for guidance. After I gave him a small nod, he signed the paper without hesitation. Scott's grin was triumphant as he grabbed the document back. Then, as if a switch had flipped, he turned to me, his voice cold and flat. "I want a divorce," he said. "I never loved you, Anna. I just put up with you for your parents' money. But now I'm rich. I don't need you anymore." His words hit me like a punch, even though deep down I had suspected this. Hearing it laid out so bluntly was still devastating. "I'm moving to Uncle John's house," Scott continued, already packing a suitcase. "Don't try to contact me. It's over." And just like that, he was gone. 33rd years of marriage packed into a suitcase and out the door. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It felt unreal, like a bad dream. I couldn't hold it together any longer. "Mom?" Peter's voice was soft, full of concern. "Mom, are you okay?" I turned to look at my son, my steady rock, and the dam broke. Tears poured down my face as Peter wrapped his arms around me. "It's okay, Mom," he whispered, holding me tight. "We'll get through this. You're strong, and you'll be okay." As I clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, I couldn't help but be amazed at the man he had become, kind and compassionate, everything his father wasn't. Then I realized something. "You're the best thing he ever did," I whispered to Peter. "The only good thing to come out of this marriage." Peter hugged me even tighter, and in that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, I wasn't alone. I had my son, and together, we'd face whatever came next. The weeks after Scott left were a blur of pain and disbelief. I tried to stay strong, to focus on moving forward, but it wasn't easy. Scott seemed determined to flaunt his new life right in my face. It started with his Facebook posts, pictures of Uncle John's mansion, which was now Scott's home, filled his timeline. I tried to ignore it and focus on healing. Then, the photos changed. A young woman started appearing in them. She was blonde, beautiful, and barely older than Peter. In one photo, Scott had his arm around her, both of them smiling at the camera. The caption made me feel sick. "Meet my fiancée, Joyce. Upgrade complete." The calls started almost immediately. Friends, acquaintances, even some of Peter's old teachers reached out. "Anna, dear, is everything okay?" We saw Scott's posts. "What's going on?" I couldn't take it anymore, the humiliation, the constant reminders of Scott's betrayal. It was all too much. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I called Scott and asked to meet. After speaking with a lawyer, the day of the meeting arrived. I waited at our old favorite cafe, divorce papers in hand. Scott strolled in with Joyce on his arm. She couldn't have been more than 27, her face covered in makeup, giggling at something Scott whispered in her ear. Well, Scott smirked as he pulled out a chair for Joyce. "If it isn't the old ball and chain." "Joyce, honey, meet Anna, the starter wife." Joyce gave me a pitying look that made my blood boil, but I kept my cool. "I have the divorce papers here," I said, sliding them across the table. "I'm not asking for much, just the house. You can keep everything else." To my surprise, Scott picked up the pen without a word. "Fine, have your little house. I've got bigger and better things now," Scott said as he scribbled his signature on the papers. Then he turned to Joyce, his voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Now I can finally be with someone I truly love, someone worthy of me." I gathered the papers, my hands shaking a little, and walked out of the cafe. Behind me, I could hear Scott's mocking laughter, but I didn't look back. I had what I came for. The next day, I filed for divorce. As I handed the papers to the court clerk, I felt a huge weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Life has a funny way of bringing justice when you least expect it. For me, it came in the form of a newspaper headline. Local business tycoon's empire crumbles, nephew left with massive debt. It turned out Uncle John had taken out a huge loan just before he passed, hoping to expand his business. He had mentioned something about a new project during our hospital visit, but Peter and I hadn't understood the impact at the time. Now it all made sense. I watched from afar as Scott's new life fell apart. He sold the factory, the mansion, the cars, everything, and he still owed nearly $1 million. The icing on the cake? His young fiancée, Joyce, packed her bags and left as soon as she realized Scott wasn't the rich man she thought he was. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a bit of satisfaction. Karma had finally caught up with Scott. Then one rainy evening, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Scott standing there, looking nothing like the smug, wealthy man who had walked out on me months ago. He was a mess, his eyes red and desperate. "Anna," he said, his voice cracking. "I've been such a fool. I see that now. Please, can we talk?" Against my better judgment, I let him in. For the next hour, I listened as Scott poured out his heart. He told me how he had lost everything and realized what really mattered in life. "I was wrong, Anna," he said, his eyes begging. "So wrong. But now I see you were the only one who ever truly cared for me, the only one I've ever really loved." Then, to my shock, Scott got down on one knee, pulling out a small velvet box. "Anna, please give me another chance. Marry me again. Together, we can get through anything." For a moment, I was speechless. Then I did something that surprised even me. I laughed. It started as a small chuckle and grew into full-blown laughter, with tears running down my face. Scott's expression dropped. "What's so funny?" he asked, confused. When I finally caught my breath, I looked Scott straight in the eye. "Oh, Scott, did you really think it would be that easy? That you could treat me like trash, throw me away, and then come crawling back when your life fell apart?" His face darkened, and he stood up, angry. "Now listen here," he snarled. "This is my house too. I have rights." I calmly walked to the drawer where I kept the divorce papers, pulled them out, and showed him his own signature. "No, Scott, you don't. You sign away any claim to this house. It's mine. Now get out, or I'll call the cops." For a moment, I thought he might argue, but something in my face must have told him I was serious. Without another word, he turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As soon as he was gone, I called Peter and told him everything. My wonderful son was, as always, supportive. "You did the right thing, Mom," he said. "I'm proud of you." Those words meant more to me than he could ever know. In the weeks that followed, I made some big decisions. The house, with all its memories both good and bad, felt too big for just me. So I sold it and used the money to buy a cozy apartment in a lively neighborhood I had always loved. At 62, I'm finding that life is just beginning. I've started traveling, visiting all the places Scott promised we'd go but never did. I've taken up painting, joined a book club, and even tried salsa dancing. Every now and then, I see Scott around town. He looks older now, worn down by his mistakes and bad choices. Life didn't turn out the way I expected, but you know what? I wouldn't change a thing. For the first time in a long time, I'm truly, completely happy being me.